Over to you, Reverend Debbie.
Okay, hopefully this works. Are you seeing my slideshow?
We see
You
it.
sure are.
Yay! Well, I am so glad to be here. So I will get right into it, and we will have time for questions at the end. So who am I? I'm Reverend Debbie Philp. I'm an ordained interspiritual minister and a graduate student studying ecology, spirituality, and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I'm also a New York State licensed wildlife rehabilitator specializing in injured freshwater turtles. And I'd like to thank the Earth-Based Spirituality Action Team for inviting me to speak today about deepening our interconnection with the wild beings around us. Oh, and I can't say no to a pigeon. So I've been thinking about this idea of real wilding for a while. But last semester, we read Wilding by Isabella Tree, and it really got me going on it. The stories Tree tells in this book about rewilding the Knepp Castle estate in the south of England were inspiring, but I had some issues with it. One is demonstrated by the quote I have here, that protecting nature has to have some economic benefit to get people on board. And spiritually, that did not sit right with me. The other is the fact that most of us don't get to inherit an estate with 3,500 acres of farmland to play with. So my research project for that class was a look at rewilding on a much smaller scale. I dug into the benefits of rewilding a typical American suburban or urban backyard. So I'm going to talk about the way I'm defining rewilding, the benefits of rewilding our backyards, including the mental and emotional benefits, the spiritual benefits, and the benefits to the ecosystem. Then I'll touch on some tips for designing your own backyard landscape. I can't tell you exactly what to do because all our native ecosystems are going to be a little different. I highly recommend reaching out to others doing this kind of work in your area, like regional pollinator projects or wildlife sanctuaries. And even though I live in rural forest, I have under an acre and started my own rewilding project on land that was nothing but grass, gravel, and a few non-native landscape shrubs when we moved in. In other words, it looked like the typical urban backyard. My goal was to bring the woods around us onto the land and restore trees and plants that were missing from my and the surrounding properties. The pictures on this and the rest of the slides are some of the wildlife we've returned since I started my habitat restoration work, like Mama Red Squirrel here. She's been pregnant the last 3 springs, and I'm so glad she hangs out and lets me help her by feeding her and her babies. So how did I first learn of rewilding? I did my initial shamanic Reiki training at Omega Institute here in New York State, and they have multiple workshops going at once. Another one happening at the same time that I was there was called rewilding. When I crossed paths with the rewilding people, they were in the woods, running around barefoot and howling like wolves. I'm sure it's a powerful practice, but it made me personally uncomfortable. I think because I've always been more practical in my spirituality, maybe because I'm a Virgo. Anyway, even though I couldn't see myself doing what they were, I was curious about the concept of rewilding the spirit. And my spiritual life since then has been an exploration of how humans might get a sense of interconnection with the rest of nature. For me, learning to coexist and actively providing space for the more than human species to live well has been my process of spiritual rewilding. I believe we thrive when we all thrive, and doing this work is reciprocity with the earth. That being said, I should define rewilding as I mean it for the rest of this presentation. So rewilding is the creation or restoration of wildlife habitats and ecosystem functions on land that was previously altered by humans to remove those things. I'll be focusing on small-scale rewilding projects in private, urban, and suburban backyards, less than an acre, because that's where I believe the greatest benefits happen, not only for wildlife and our spirituality, but as a means to inspire others to take it on too. And while I didn't consider them for this presentation, I want to note that balconies and rooftop gardens are also places that can be rewilded with many of the same benefits. So put some native plants in pots on your balcony or patio if you don't have a yard. As a resource to get started, I like National Wildlife Federation's backyard habitat certification guidelines, making sure the yard provides food, water, cover, and places to raise young, plus freedom from toxins, and using gardening practices like composting that improve soil health. These projects usually include native plants, supplemental feeders, water features, bird boxes, and other things that restore or at least try to replicate the habitat that existed before the land was developed. I want to point out that the message most of us have received about wildlife conservation is that it takes place in some far-off land and protects exotic species that we will never encounter without going on safari or something. Meanwhile, species that might be found in our backyards are disappearing because they aren't exciting enough to get attention. For example, amphibians, like this little American toad who does a great job of eating bugs in my vegetable garden, are declining at an overall rate of about 4% a year. The US Geological Survey reports that toads, frogs, and salamanders will be gone from half the places they are found today in under 20 years. Providing even small areas of habitat that will support them and not spraying pesticides can really help them. I believe there's great potential to enhance the well-being of humans and wildlife alike, and maybe even save some of them through this kind of small-scale rewilding. I should probably also define wildlife for this context. I've distilled wildlife to mean the animals and insects that live wild in an area without having been introduced by humans. So while chickens are great, they aren't wildlife. Technically, neither are my pigeon friends, since they are the feral descendants of pigeons brought here by Europeans and abandoned, like too many cats. It's important to remember that wildlife that comes in may include predators who are not going to pass up a free meal. So coexistence means doing everything possible to keep the chickens and the foxes from ever meeting, for instance. All right, let's talk about how rewilding our backyard helps us humans. There's plenty of documented evidence that time in nature improves our mental health. Stress is reduced. Feelings of peace and calm increase. Well-being is also greatly enhanced by gardening. So wouldn't making a garden feel more like nature be even better? It turns out that yes, the beneficial mental effects of gardening increase when there's more biodiversity, which is the number of different species in an area, as well as the quantity of each species. You might be familiar with the late E.O. Wilson. He called the experience of being surrounded by biodiversity biophilia, and said that it's really rooted in our evolution. For most of human genetic history, we had to be intimately involved with the natural world. We still need to relate to other forms of life to feel human. We just numb it most of the time. The act of creating habitat and then being in it, watching the wildlife that's now present, it all invites us to slow down even bringing on a meditative state that reduces mental strain and quiets worrying thoughts. You really just stop and stare and forget about the other stuff for a while. Rewilding is also a confidence booster. I remember the first time a hummingbird ate from a plant that I chose, hoping they would like it. It's so gratifying, and studies show that rewilders who have small successes, like that one, are more likely to experiment with bigger projects and continue developing their stewardship. Of course, mental well-being is related to spiritual well-being. Wildlife watching doesn't just reduce stress. It invokes feelings of wonder, awe, and just the magic of life. You may even have moments of sensing the larger reality and realizing that you are part of it. You can really tune in. In one study of gardeners who did rewilding, respondents could describe all the different plants and wildlife in their gardens, the way wildlife moved through the space, and all the seasonal changes that happen. Imagine how intimately connected to the land they must feel knowing all that. And in the fact that you created the space for those experiences, like keeping a water dish full or hanging a nest box for owls, that you are physically engaged in the ecosystem, not just looking at something over there. And interconnection becomes an embodied experience. Interconnection is another one of those things that has two meanings here. I was just speaking about the human sense of feeling part of nature, part of the ecosystem. But wildlife habitat also needs interconnection. Not only does a rewilded backyard create a pocket of biodiversity, but it becomes part of a corridor between larger habitats, especially if you can get some of your neighbors to do the same. And it matters. Imagine how hard it would be for a bee to fly a mile without some place to rest and eat. And youngsters can't travel that far either, like this fledgling blue jay, who needs to take a break often between practice flights. By creating interconnection between larger habitats, rewilded backyards actually contribute to broader conservation efforts. There are other benefits to the ecosystem too. One is when we have droughts or just temperature extremes, like we've been seeing more often in our climate changed world, rural agriculture and forested landscapes may actually provide fewer resources to wildlife than a suburban backyard. For example, because we've directed water to homes and out of wetlands for human benefit, we can provide water for the wildlife as it's drying up elsewhere. It would have been better if we left the water where it was, but we can figure out how to help by starting with what we have now. And you might find this surprising, but most agricultural land supports less biodiversity than urban areas because it's large fields of only one habitat type. While backyards offer variety. You may have shrubs, flower gardens, grass, hopefully native, and trees in one backyard. Cities and suburbs have become desirable stopovers for migrating wildlife too. There in those spaces, food sources are condensed into small areas, like feeders or native shrubs, meaning they don't have to expend as much energy looking for it. And there are fewer predators, so they can rest safely. Rewilded backyards also support pollinators, and adding native plants can reduce the impact of ornamental plant species, which take up space on the land without providing any benefit to the ecosystem and sometimes become invasive, especially without competition from natives. You just need to do your research because often plants sold to attract pollinators may not be truly beneficial to the pollinators in your area. For example, that popular butterfly bush, which does provide some nectar, isn't host to any caterpillars, while a native plant may feed adults and caterpillars alike. And now a few tips. When you start providing food, shelter, water, and safe places to raise their young, you're gonna start seeing more wildlife coming into the space. One thing to keep in mind is it may take some time for the beings to realize they are safe among the humans who live there. The fight or flight instinct may kick in when you approach, and the last thing you want is for that being to feel trapped. So consider where they can run, fly, or slither to get away from you. It doesn't have to be a tunnel to the next town. As long as there are places to hide that they can easily get to without having to run right past you, you're good. Another thing to consider is accessibility. You can't get the benefits of interacting with wildlife if you can't actually get into the space. So consider the human needs too. Walking paths, areas for kids to play, seating, and the like, situated between and integrated into the wildlife habitat you're creating, make the space more enjoyable and provide more opportunities for wildlife watching. And you want to balance making it beautiful for humans, as well as providing habitat. There are lots of lovely native wildflowers and flowering shrubs that look great in a garden bed, which might keep your neighbors happy too. And scent is so important to humans. So find some sweet smelling plants. Finally, keep in mind that you need to balance aesthetics and function. A lot of the birdhouses and those bug hotels are made to be pretty to look at for humans, but they aren't the best for the intended inhabitants. Some have toxic paint, and others have entrances that are too easy for predators to get into. So you have to look hard at what you're buying and making, and choose function over aesthetics if you have to. But what's most important is that you do this out of love and care. Because Isabella Tree is wrong when she says we won't rewild unless it makes us money. Or maybe, I don't know, that only applies to the people who live in a castle. And enjoy the experience of the magic of interconnection. Too few of us humans do. So to end, I want to point out that my volunteer work as a wildlife rehabilitator and environmental educator inspired a big expansion of my own backyard rewilding project. And getting to know the more than human world in an intimate way has greatly influenced my journey of spiritual rewilding. I hope you found inspiration to try some real wilding too. And before you ask, Merlina the Raven is not mine, but I get to hold her at events with her keeper. And the turtle is a wood turtle patient I just released over the weekend after he spent the winter in care. He was beautiful, but he had some attitude. One way I've learned about habitat is through researching to figure out the best way to make long-term patients comfortable. And I thank you for listening. My contact info is here, and we have time for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. So why don't we go ahead and stop sharing so that we can end recording, and then we can go ahead and have, if anybody has questions, if anybody has questions, you can either